Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at a couple of Rhodesian manufacture simple, crude carbines, pistols and carbines. So these are both made by a company called Northwood Developments, and this is an R76 machine pistol, and this is an M77 machine carbine. Now, despite the machine in the names, these are both semi-automatic. They were both marketed primarily to the civilian population of Rhodesia, and Rhodesian law basically prohibited ownership of fully automatic firearms by civilians in that country. So these both fire from an open bolt, but they're semi-automatic only. That's something that is legal in many parts of the world, not legal in the United States right now, due to just a quirk in our laws. So these were developed in 1976, developed by a guy named Roger Mansfield with the assistance of a guy named Joe Hale. And Joe Hale is an interesting name in Rhodesian firearms development. He's the guy behind the Jumbo shotgun and the Mamba pistol, and he was pretty clearly a con man. But we'll get to Joe Hale in a separate video later on. Today we're looking at these guys. Now, being developed in 1976, these were actually probably, as best I can tell, the first of this sort of gun to actually make it onto production. They were far from the last, but there were a number of developers in Rhodesia, gun designers, who were kind of racing to get to market first. And Northwood Development did it. They're the ones who managed it. So these are both in 9mm parabellum. They use Browning high-power magazines, although the magazines here are Rhodesian manufactured magazines, and they, in this case, we have a 30-rounder here. They also made 20-rounders in addition to the standard 13-round capacity magazine for the pistol. These magazines are interchangeable with the pistols, even the long ones. So, and then open bolt, semi-automatic only. They are, apparently they have a reputation for being pretty good guns, pretty reliable guns, but they're definitely quite crude in manufacture. They're a little bit more complex to take apart than you might expect. They're really a bit quirky. So the idea behind this whole thing was that it was meant to be a complete weapons system. And to that end, the receivers and the inner workings and the magazines and the fire control groups are all identical. Well, identical with the exception that they did make some full auto ones, but the significant majority were semi-automatic, and the full auto ones were only marketed to the military and the police. Outside of the receiver, though, there was a bunch of modularity. So they had 4 different types of barrels that you could get, 4 different barrel lengths, 150, 200, and 267mm, and that comes out to basically like 6.1, 8-inch, and 10.9-inch. They had a version of the barrel that was plain like this one. They also had a version with a bayonet lug, and you could get a bayonet. They had a bipod that could clamp onto the barrel. They had both a wooden buttstock like this and a collapsing metal buttstock like this one. And all of those parts were completely interchangeable. It's actually quite easy to screw the barrel off of this and swap it out. So this cool modular sort of idea. Now, despite that, they are relatively heavy guns. They come in at about 3.5 kilograms, which is, what, like 8.5 pounds for a semi-automatic 9mm carbine. The sights are pretty crude. The trigger's not very good because it's an open bolt gun. Simple blowback operation. This is pretty typical of the Rhodesian and later some of the early South African domestic manufactured guns. They worked, but they're not that great. To me, in my mind, there are a lot of similarities here to firearms manufactured in the Confederacy during the American Civil War. Both of these were areas that were largely cut off from outside supply. They didn't have a lot of indigenous industrial infrastructure, and they decided that they needed guns, and so they started manufacturing stuff from whatever was available and at hand. And the results were often functional but crude. So let's pull one of these apart, and I'll show you exactly how it works on the inside. Here is the R76, the short-barreled version, and just for comparison, I've got a standard high power there to go with it. So it's a big gun. If we take a look at the controls, there is a selector switch here. 2 positions, safe, up there, and R for repetition. These guns used a lot of the Rhodesian and South African stuff, copied the British pattern for selector markings, which was safe, repetition, automatic, S, R, and A. On the full auto version, I've seen a picture of one. I've never actually seen one in person. There is a third detent down here that is A for automatic. You'll note that there is a designation molded into the grip panel of R76. And then the serial number is up here. I have no, well, ND is almost certainly Northwood Developments. No idea what the SJ stands for. The S may be Salisbury, or maybe not. And then serial number on this one is 632. We have a little P in a triangle right there. That is a Rhodesian proof mark. They did, in fact, proof the guns. The bolt handle here is non-reciprocating and spring-loaded. So you can see the spring in there, and it's going to snap forward after you lock the bolt open. It does fire from an open bolt. Kerchunk, like that. The magazine release is a particularly quirky thing on this gun. It's this tab right here. Really simplistic. And what you do is you lift it up against this little retaining bar, like so, and then you can pull the magazine out. Now, if you're left-handed, this is very tricky. I think the idea is that as a right-hander, you're holding this. This is fixed in place, and this acts as your front grip. And you use your thumb to push that in, and then you can pull out the magazine. So this is a Rhodesian manufacturer 30-round mag. As I said, they also had 20s and standard 13-round pistol magazines. To deploy the stock, you have to grab these two pins and pull them both down. That will allow it to clear the catch on the rods. There we go. So there are the catches for when it's open. They snap into place like that. There's your stock fully extended. You can also then take the stock entirely off by just lifting them up and pulling the stock out. For sights, we have a rear aperture and a winged front barleycorn. Not particularly good sights. They work, but eh. It certainly doesn't help that the rear sight is actually mounted on this rear plate that is the first thing you take off for disassembly. Actually, I'm sorry, it's the second thing you take off for disassembly, because the first is the ejector. So we have a thumb screw here. If I take this off, you know, there's always a question of if you have a fixed blade ejector in a gun, you have to somehow be able to get it out of the way in order to disassemble the thing. And you know, there are various clever engineering tricks for doing that. Northwood did not use a clever engineering trick. They used a removable extractor. So I can take this screw out, and then there's the, or I'm sorry, not extractor, the ejector just comes out as a unit. So now it's out of the way. Next up for disassembly, we're going to pull the rear cap off. That's another thumb tightened screw. Take that out. Then we take the rear cap off. The rear cap has the rear sight on it as well. When this screw is in place, it's threaded into this crossbar, so that crossbar can't move. Once I take the back cap off, though, I can push this down and then push this bar out. There we go, that comes out. And now I can pull out the bolt assembly on this guy. Pull it past the sear. There's our bolt assembly. Now we have just an open receiver tube. I don't know if you can see it there. Yeah, you can see it in silhouette, the sear dropping there. Fires from an open bolt, so that's all you've got inside the receiver tube. And lastly, we can take the barrel off. So there's a hole there that is probably so that you can get a semicircular wrench onto it. But there we go, barrel comes off. There's a nice simple front trunnion here. It's maybe about that long, and it's just a threaded socket for the barrel. And it's got a screw here on the side that helps hold it in place and is also the attachment point for the spring on the charging handle. It's worth pointing out that originally there was a bar across this to prevent the charging handle from lifting up in its slot. Virtually all of those bars have broken off, as has this one. So there's the stripped lower assembly, all sheet metal, trunnion stuck in there. You can see some of the spring attachments for the trigger right there through the open ejector plate. That's that. So the bolt assembly has two captured recoil springs, and they're held in place by this little handle sort of wire. So if I pull this out, the plate comes off and the springs come off and then the rods come out. There's no reason we need to take those apart. However, one of the interesting things about this is when you install this front plate, there we go, this front plate actually stays held in place at the front of the receiver. What initially looks like a cool recessed bolt face is actually not. Instead, the barrel sits right in like that. This bent piece of metal right here is actually the feed ramp, and this is part of the reason that you have to take the ejector out before you can disassemble the gun, because the ejector sits right up in here, and the feed ramp and this front plate would prevent the bolt from coming out unless you can remove this. Aside from that plate, there's not a whole lot going on here. We have an extractor on the side and a fixed firing pin milled into the bolt face. They did hollow out a lot of the bolt. I suspect this is as large as it is because that's the size of square tubing that was available to them. And so they then hollowed the bolt out enough that it would actually cycle. Sear engagement surface is right there. And that's pretty much all there is to this thing. This is the open, this is what the bolt handle catches on back there to cycle the bolt back. And one last thing to mention, on the full-length stocked carbine version, the stock attaches the same way. So if I lift this up, I can pop out the buttstock, and these stocks are interchangeable with the collapsing wire stocks. They just snap right in like that. So the design was 1976. The short version, the R76, came out in 1977, actual deliveries. The carbine version, the longer one, was actually started deliveries in 78, and it was named the M77, although all the parts are interchangeable in the platform. By 1979, by the end of 79, they'd made over 1,000 of them, and ultimately they would make about 2,000 of these guns. So it's actually not a tiny number. That's somewhat impressive. The vast majority of them stayed in Rhodesia. A few were exported to South Africa. And it's possible that a few made it out of the area into other countries, but I haven't seen any documentation of that. They were all sold by a gun shop, the L.G. Harrison gun shop in Salisbury, Rhodesia, was the retailer. So these were being manufactured by Northwood Development in Salisbury and then retailed by a gun shop there. So that's how they actually got out and into people's hands. They were pretty expensive. Apparently the price started at $230. By the end of production, it had climbed to $400. Honestly, I don't know what that translates to if we were to try and convert it to, say, American dollars today. But I can tell you that relative to the other guns available at the time, things like the LDP to become the Commando, it was a pretty expensive gun. And I don't know that that expense is really justified in the construction and the design. So there you have the first of the Rhodesian domestic, primarily ladies' self-defense weapons. The full auto version was apparently at least evaluated by the Rhodesian military. I'm pretty sure they'd have to be fairly desperate to adopt it. If anything, that may have been an attempt to replace the Uzi in Rhodesian service. They did have a few of those. It was also examined by some police forces, and apparently these were actually used by the British South African Police Reserve. So that's like the first tier of officialdom, I guess, is a reserve police unit. I don't think they ever saw official use with the Rhodesian military, but at some point during Rhodesia combat history, they may have gotten picked up out of necessity. So anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. It's pretty cool to get to take a look at the two different versions of what is really the first of these indigenous Rhodesian locally made carbines. So thank you very much for watching.